They called her a disgrace to the uniform, until her final act silenced the entire base. She was different from day one, refused to shout, never boasted, didn't fit the image they expected. Disgrace to the uniform, some whispered, watching her train in silence. But when her unit was surrounded in a remote village, outnumbered and cornered, she stepped forward, unarmed, calm, steady. In their language, she spoke. Slowly, clearly, her voice cut through the chaos. And then, one by one, the enemy laid down their rifles. From which country are you watching this video today? If you appreciate stories that reveal how true courage comes not from force but from understanding, consider subscribing for more content that explores the extraordinary power of human connection. The pre-dawn darkness of forward operating base Kestrel hung heavy with anticipation as First Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez entered the communications bunker at 0545 hours. The overnight watch maintained their vigilance over radio frequencies and surveillance feeds, faces illuminated by the green glow of night vision monitors and tactical displays. Rodriguez moved with the confident stride of a 22-year veteran, his coffee steaming in the dry Afghan air as he approached Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez at the primary intelligence station. "Situation report," he said, his voice carrying the authority earned through multiple deployments across 3 continents. Staff Sergeant Vasquez straightened, her fingers momentarily pausing over the encrypted keyboard. "All quiet on the perimeter, First Sergeant." Standard patrol rotations completed without incident, except she tapped several keys, bringing up a detailed topographical map on the main display. Intel reports increased chatter in Pashto around grid coordinates 42 STD 15847, 23956. Village of Kala saved, approximately 15 clicks northeast of our position. Rodriguez set his coffee down, leaning closer to study the terrain features. Nature of the chatter? Unclear, First Sergeant. Our translators are working through intercepted communications, but the dialect is specific to that region. Local linguistic patterns we haven't fully mapped. Vasquez highlighted several audio files on her screen. What's concerning is the timing coordinated transmissions at 0300, 0330, and 0400 hours. That suggests organization. The First Sergeant's expression hardened as he examined the village's strategic position. Kala Safe sat in a natural depression surrounded by rocky hills, with only 2 viable approach routes, a tactical nightmare for any force operating in the area. It was also directly along the supply route their convoys used twice weekly. Continue monitoring and expand our translation efforts. Contact Lieutenant Chin's unit. They're conducting cultural liaison operations in that sector. His tone brooked no discussion. And get me Captain Morrison. As Vasquez implemented his orders, Rodriguez stepped toward the secure communications terminal. This wouldn't be the first time local insurgent cells had attempted to disrupt coalition operations through coordinated attacks. But something about the pattern felt different, more deliberate, more patient than the usual opportunistic strikes they encountered. 25 minutes later, with intercepted communications continuing and the morning sun beginning to illuminate the Afghan mountains, Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. Staff Sergeant, prepare a reconnaissance patrol. Full squad, light armor, departure in 90 minutes. The motor pool came alive with activity as soldiers from 3rd Squad, Alpha Company prepared their vehicles and equipment. Sergeant Tyler Bulldog Morrison called out assignments with characteristic volume, his voice echoing across the compound as soldiers loaded magazines and performed pre-combat inspections. "Chin, you're on comms and cultural liaison. Keep that language training sharp, we might need it today." Morrison's attention turned to the soldier who had just emerged from the barracks, moving with quiet efficiency toward the equipment storage. "Reeves, standard loadout, but bring extra medical supplies. Unknown terrain, unknown threats." Private First Class Sarah Chin nodded acknowledgement, checking her radio equipment with methodical precision. She had earned her position as cultural liaison through intensive language study and an intuitive understanding of local customs that had proven invaluable during her 8-month deployment. But among her squad mates, her approach often drew criticism. "There she goes again," muttered Specialist James Hawkins, watching Chin perform her equipment checks in characteristic silence. No war face, no motivation. You'd think she was going to a tea party instead of a recon mission. Private Marcus Thompson joined the conversation, adjusting his body armor with aggressive efficiency. "I still don't get why they sent her to a combat unit. All that book learning and cultural sensitivity doesn't stop bullets." Chin continued her preparations, outwardly unaffected by the commentary. She had heard variations of these criticisms since arriving at FOB Kestrel. Her quiet demeanor, her preference for observation over aggression, her tendency to speak softly even during high-stress situations, all of it marked her as different from the warrior archetype her fellow soldiers embodied. Sergeant Morrison approached, his expression businesslike. "Chin, you're riding with me in the lead vehicle. If we encounter locals, you're our primary interface. Remember, these people have been dealing with outsiders for centuries. Respect gets better results than intimidation." "Understood, Sergeant," Chin replied, her voice calm and professional. "Also," Morrison continued, lowering his voice slightly, "ignore the noise from the others. You've proven yourself in 12 previous missions. Your approach works." As the patrol prepared to depart, Hawkins made one final comment loud enough for Chin to hear. "Just don't expect the rest of us to sing folk songs if things get hot out there." Chin's only response was to continue checking her equipment. She had learned long ago that arguing with perception was futile. Results spoke louder than rhetoric, and she was prepared to deliver whatever results the mission required. The convoy departed FB Kestrel at 0730 hours, for up-armored Humvees carrying 12 soldiers toward an uncertain encounter in Afghanistan's unforgiving terrain. None of them realized they were about to witness a demonstration of courage that would redefine their understanding of what it meant to wear the uniform. The winding mountain road toward Kali Safe tested both vehicles and nerves as the patrol navigated switchbacks that offered commanding views of the valley below. Chin rode in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, studying the landscape through reinforced windows while monitoring radio traffic between FOB Kestrel and various coalition units operating in the region. Getting more chatter on the intercepts, she reported to Morrison, adjusting her headset. "The dialect is definitely Pashto, but with regional variations I'm still working through. What I can make out suggests some kind of gathering or meeting planned for today." Morrison nodded, his attention split between Chin's analysis and the treacherous road ahead. "Hostile or friendly? Unclear yet. The tone doesn't sound aggressive, but there are words I don't recognize. Could be code, could be local terminology we haven't cataloged." Chin's fingers moved across her electronic translator, cross-referencing audio samples with linguistic databases. "I need to hear more context to be certain." Behind them, the rest of the patrol maintained tactical spacing while enduring the bone-jarring ride over terrain that challenged even their heavily modified vehicles. In the second Humvee, Hawkins voiced what several soldiers were thinking. "Bet you $5 we're driving into an ambush. All this intelligence gathering, all this cultural sensitivity, and we'll still end up in a firefight because someone made the wrong assumptions." Thompson, manning the turret-mounted machine gun, kept his eyes on the high ground surrounding their route. "Intel's only as good as the person interpreting it. Hope Chin's language skills are better than her combat instincts." Their disparaging comments were interrupted by Morrison's voice over the radio. "All vehicles, halt. We've got movement ahead." The convoy stopped on a ridge overlooking Kali Safe, and through binoculars, the soldiers could see unusual activity in the village below. Groups of men were gathering in the central square, and several vehicles, including what appeared to be technicals mounted with heavy weapons, were positioned around the settlement's perimeter. "Definitely not normal market day activity," Morrison observed, passing his binoculars to Chin. "What's your assessment?" Chin studied the scene carefully, noting details that others might miss. The body language of the gathered men, the positioning of the vehicles, the presence of women and children moving in specific patterns around the village's edges. "It's organized, but I don't think it's military," she said finally. "The vehicle positioning isn't tactical, they're more like a show of force. And the way people are moving suggests this is planned, but not necessarily hostile. Could be a tribal council meeting, dispute resolution, something ceremonial." Morrison considered her analysis while monitoring radio communications from their base. FB Kestrel reports the communication intercepts have intensified. "Whatever's happening down there, it's significant." "Sergeant," Chin said quietly, lowering the binoculars. "Request permission to try direct communication. If this is a tribal gathering, approaching with respect might get us better intelligence than surveillance." Hawkins's voice crackled over the radio from the second vehicle. "Bad idea, Chin. We don't know their intentions, we don't know their numbers, and we definitely don't know if they're friendly." "Specialist Hawkins has a point," Morrison replied. "Standard protocol would be to observe and report, let higher command decide on engagement." Chin's response was characteristically thoughtful. "Understood, Sergeant. But if they're gathered for legitimate reasons, our presence here could be seen as threatening. We might be creating the very hostility we're trying to avoid." Before Morrison could respond, The situation changed dramatically. One of the vehicles in the village below began moving toward their position, followed by two others. The patrol found itself detected and potentially outmaneuvered. "Contact front," Thompson called out, swiveling his weapon system toward the approaching vehicles. 3 technicals, estimated 12 to 15 personnel, closing on our position. Morrison's training kicked in immediately. "All vehicles, tactical formation. Prepare for contact, but do not engage unless fired upon." He grabbed his radio handset. "FB Kestrel, this is Recon Alpha. We have multiple vehicles approaching our position. Request immediate support and extraction options." The response from base was immediate but not encouraging. "Recon Alpha, nearest support is 25 minutes out. Maintain defensive positions and attempt peaceful resolution if possible." 25 minutes might as well have been 25 hours. The approaching vehicles had them at a tactical disadvantage, with superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Chin watched the situation develop with growing certainty that conventional military responses would only escalate toward violence. "Sergeant," she said, her voice cutting through the tension in their vehicle, "let me try to communicate with them. If this goes bad, we're outnumbered and outpositioned. But if I can establish dialogue—" "Negative, Chin. Too dangerous." The lead enemy vehicle stopped approximately 200 meters away, close enough for the patrol to see armed men dismounting while maintaining cover behind their truck. The other vehicles positioned themselves to flank the American position, creating a tactical situation that would be difficult to fight their way out of. Morrison assessed their options rapidly. Retreat would mean exposing their vehicles to fire during the most vulnerable moments. Advancing would be suicidal. Remaining stationary gave the enemy time to improve their positioning. "All stations, prepare for defensive action," he ordered, though he knew their chances were slim. That's when Chin made a decision that would change everything. Without waiting for permission, she opened her door and stepped out of the vehicle, removing her helmet and setting down her weapon in clear view of the surrounding forces. "Chin, get back in the vehicle," Morrison shouted, but she was already walking slowly toward the center of the confrontation, her hands visible and empty. In the growing silence between the two forces, her voice carried clearly across the rocky terrain as she called out in fluent Pashto, her tone respectful and non-threatening. The words flowed with perfect pronunciation and cultural awareness, addressing the gathering as honored elders rather than enemies. The effect was immediate and profound. The armed men who had been preparing for conflict paused, weapons lowering slightly as they processed her unexpected approach. One elderly man, clearly a leader among them, stepped forward from behind his vehicle. What followed was a conversation that none of the American soldiers could fully understand, but whose tone and cadence suggested careful negotiation rather than confrontation. Chin's posture remained respectful but confident, her gestures emphasizing points while maintaining the formal courtesy appropriate to addressing tribal elders. Hawkins, watching through his rifle scope, muttered into his radio, "What the hell is she doing? She's going to get herself killed, and probably the rest of us too." But Morrison, observing more carefully, noticed something different happening. The hostile positioning of the opposing forces was beginning to relax. Weapons that had been aimed at American positions were now pointed toward the ground. The body language of the gathered men shifted from aggressive readiness to cautious attention. After what felt like hours but was probably less than 10 minutes, Chin turned and walked back toward the American vehicles, her pace deliberate and unhurried. The armed men remained in position but no longer maintained combat-ready stances. "Report," Morrison demanded as soon as she was back within the safety of their perimeter. "They're conducting a traditional dispute resolution council," Chin explained, her breathing steady despite the stress of the encounter. "Two families have been in conflict over water rights and grazing boundaries. The weapons were a show of strength, not preparation for attack. They interpreted our surveillance as either interference or a potential threat to the proceedings." Morrison processed this information while keeping one eye on the still-present opposition forces. "And now?" I explained that we were conducting routine security patrols and had no intention of interfering with their traditional processes. The elder, Ahmad Shah Massoud, he's actually the regional council chairman, invited us to observe the proceedings as neutral witnesses. It's considered an honor in their culture. The transformation of the situation from potential combat to diplomatic opportunity left the American soldiers struggling to adjust their mindset. Thompson, still manning his weapon, asked the question on everyone's mind. "So we're not under threat anymore?" "We never really were," Chen replied. "This was a misunderstanding that could have escalated into violence if we'd responded with force. But because we approached with respect, They're treating us as honored guests rather than invaders. Morrison made the call to FB Kestrel, reporting the peaceful resolution and requesting guidance for their next actions. The response came back quickly: observe, document, and gather any intelligence relevant to regional stability. What the American patrol witnessed over the next 3 hours challenged their preconceptions about Afghan culture and the complexity of local conflicts. The Tribal Council conducted its proceedings with elaborate ceremony, hearing testimony from both sides of the water rights dispute while maintaining dignity for all participants. Chen served as translator and cultural guide, helping her fellow soldiers understand the nuances of what they were observing. The dispute resolution process emphasized restoration over punishment, community harmony over individual victory. This is how they've managed conflicts for over 1,000 years, she explained quietly to Morrison as they watched the proceedings. It's not primitive, it's sophisticated. They understand that keeping the community intact is more important than determining who's right or wrong. As the afternoon progressed, something remarkable happened. The American soldiers found themselves genuinely welcomed by their former adversaries. Tea was offered, conversations developed through Chin's translation, and mutual respect began to replace mutual suspicion. Hawkins, who had been most critical of Chin's unconventional approach, found himself engaged in a detailed discussion about farming techniques with a young Afghan man who spoke broken English. Thompson discovered that one of the tribal elders had served as an interpreter for Soviet forces in the 1980s and had fascinating perspectives on the cyclical nature of foreign intervention. "You know," Hawkins said quietly to Chin during a break in the proceedings, "I owe you an apology. This isn't what I expected when we left base this morning." Chin's response was characteristic in its simplicity. Different doesn't mean wrong, specialist. Sometimes the best way to serve is to listen before you act. As the Tribal Council reached its resolution, a water-sharing agreement that satisfied both families while strengthening community bonds, Chin found herself at the center of an unexpected development. The tribal elder who had initially confronted their patrol approached her directly, speaking in rapid Pashto while the other American soldiers watched with curiosity. "What's he saying?" Morrison asked. Chin's expression showed surprise and something like honor as she listened. "He's offering me a position as a formal liaison between their council and coalition forces. He says I understand the importance of respect and building peace." The return journey to FB Kestrel took place in contemplative silence, with each soldier processing what they had experienced. The mission that had begun as a routine reconnaissance patrol had become something unprecedented, a genuine diplomatic breakthrough achieved through cultural understanding rather than military force. Morrison, driving the lead vehicle, finally broke the silence. "Chin, I need to ask you something. How did you know that approaching them unarmed would work? How did you know they weren't hostile?" Chin considered the question carefully before responding. "I didn't know, Sergeant. But I knew that treating them as enemies would guarantee they became enemies. Sometimes you have to choose to trust before you have reasons to trust. That's a hell of a risk to take with other people's lives," Thompson observed from the turret. "So is assuming the worst about people based on their appearance or location," Chin replied quietly. "Every approach involves risk. I chose the risk that offered the possibility of peace instead of the certainty of conflict." As they crested the final ridge before FB Kestrel came into view, Hawkins made an observation that would stay with all of them. "You know what's weird? I feel like we accomplished more today than in my last 6 months of patrols combined. And we never fired a shot." Word of the successful mission reached FB Kestrel before the patrol's return, and by the time their vehicles rolled through the main gate, a small crowd had gathered to hear details of their unexpected diplomatic triumph. First Sergeant Rodriguez met them at the motor pool, his expression mixing relief with curiosity. "Hell of a thing, what you did out there, Chin," he said as the soldiers dismounted and began their post-mission procedures. "Colonel wants a full debrief in 30 minutes. Chin nodded acknowledgement, but her attention was drawn to the reactions of other soldiers around the motor pool. The conversations she could overhear ranged from impressed to skeptical, with several veterans expressing doubt about the wisdom of her unarmed approach. "Lucky it worked out," one staff sergeant commented to his buddy. "But that's not the kind of risk you can take very often. Next time, they might not be so reasonable." Chin understood the criticism and even agreed with parts of it. Her approach had involved significant risk, and success in one situation didn't guarantee success in others. But she also understood something that many of her critics missed: the relationship between means and ends, between how you achieved peace and whether that peace would last. During the formal debriefing, Colonel Patricia Hawthorne listened to Morrison's report with the attention of an officer who understood both tactical success and strategic implications. When he finished, she turned her focus to Chin. Private First Class Chin, your actions today were unconventional. Walk me through your decision-making process. Chin straightened, choosing her words carefully. Ma'am, the tactical situation was unfavorable for conventional engagement. We were outnumbered and outpositioned. But the intelligence suggested we might be dealing with local civilians rather than insurgents. I believed that treating them with respect might reveal their true intentions. And if you'd been wrong? If they had been hostile? Then we would have faced the same tactical disadvantage, but without the additional escalation that comes from treating peaceful people as enemies, Chin replied. I assessed that the risk of approach was lower than the risk of assuming hostility. Colonel Hawthorne studied Chin's service record on her tablet, noting commendations for cultural sensitivity and language proficiency alongside criticism for insufficient aggressive posture and overly cautious engagement protocols. Your unconventional methods seem to produce results, Chin, but they also concern some of your superiors. Military effectiveness traditionally relies on predictable responses to threatening situations. Yes, ma'am, but effectiveness should be measured by mission success, not adherence to traditional methods. Our mission was reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. We achieved both objectives while establishing positive relations with local leadership. The debriefing continued for another hour, covering operational details, intelligence gathered, and potential implications for future operations in the region. When it concluded, Colonel Hawthorne made an announcement that surprised everyone present. Private First Class Chin, you're being reassigned to the Cultural Advisory Team, effective immediately. Your primary responsibility will be developing protocols for civilian engagement that balance security requirements with diplomatic opportunities. As the personnel filed out of the briefing room, Morrison approached Chin with an expression that mixed respect with concern. Hell of a promotion, Chin. You've earned it. But watch yourself. Not everyone's going to appreciate your methods, even when they work. Chin nodded understanding. I know, Sergeant. Change makes people uncomfortable, especially in an institution built on tradition and proven methods. It's not just about comfort, Morrison continued. The military works because everyone knows what to expect from everyone else. When you operate outside those expectations, you might be right, but you also create uncertainty. So do the people we're trying to serve alongside, Sergeant. Maybe some uncertainty is worth it if it leads to better outcomes. That evening, as Chen packed her belongings for transfer to the Cultural Advisory Team, Hawkins approached her with an expression she'd never seen from him before, something approaching humility. Chen, I wanted to say something before you move to your new assignment. What happened today, it changed how I think about what we're doing here. Maybe there's more than one way to serve with honor. Chen paused in her packing, considering how to respond. Specialist, every soldier serves according to their strengths. You're brave, decisive, protective of your team. Those qualities saved lives today just as much as my approach did. The difference is knowing when to use which tool. I've been thinking about that, Hawkins continued. About tools, I mean. I guess I always thought courage meant being ready to fight. But what you did today, walking out there unarmed, trusting people who could have killed you, that took a different kind of courage. Not different, Chin corrected gently. Just focused differently. You were ready to fight to protect all of us. I was ready to trust to protect all of us. Both required courage. Both served the mission. Their conversation was interrupted by Thompson, who had been quiet since their return. Chin, can I ask you something? When you stepped out of that vehicle, what were you thinking? I mean, what was going through your head? Chin sat down on her bunk, her expression thoughtful. Honestly, I was terrified. But I was more afraid of what would happen if we treated a peaceful gathering as a military threat. Fear of making the wrong choice pushed me toward making what I hoped was the right choice. How do you live with that kind of uncertainty? Thompson asked. How do you make decisions when you can't know the outcome? The same way you do when you're in combat, Chin replied. You use your training, you trust your instincts, and you accept responsibility for the consequences. The only difference is that my training included cultural awareness and conflict de-escalation, not just tactical response. As word of Chin's reassignment spread through the base, reactions varied widely. Some soldiers expressed admiration for her innovative approach and successful results. Others worried that emphasizing diplomatic solutions might weaken military readiness or send mixed messages about American resolve. Sergeant First Class David Martinez, a veteran of 3 deployments, voiced concerns shared by many of the senior enlisted personnel. Don't get me wrong, what Chin did was impressive. But we can't have every soldier deciding to go off script based on their personal assessment of the situation. Military discipline exists for a reason. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, who had been monitoring communications during the mission, offered a different perspective. Maybe the script needs updating. Chin's approach didn't just resolve one crisis. It opened up intelligence channels we never had before. That tribal elder has agreed to share information about regional activities. That's worth more than a dozen standard patrols. The debate reflected broader questions about military adaptation in complex cultural environments. Traditional military doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and clear chains of command. But operations in Afghanistan required nuanced understanding of local customs, tribal politics, and religious sensitivities. Colonel Hawthorne found herself at the center of these discussions as she prepared reports for division headquarters. Chin's success represented both an opportunity and a challenge, an opportunity to develop more effective engagement strategies, but a challenge to existing protocols and training programs. The question isn't whether Chin's approach worked, she explained to her staff during their evening briefing. The question is whether we can systematize it without losing its essential humanity. Can we teach cultural sensitivity and conflict de-escalation as military skills rather than personal attributes? Major Robert Kingston, the base's operations officer, raised practical concerns. Ma'am, with respect, Chin's success depended heavily on her individual language skills and cultural knowledge. Most of our personnel don't have that level of preparation. Are we expecting every soldier to become a diplomat? Not a diplomat, Hawthorne replied. But maybe we need to expand our definition of military readiness. In counterinsurgency operations, cultural competence might be as important as marksmanship. Understanding local customs might be as valuable as understanding enemy tactics. The discussion continued late into the evening, touching on training requirements, resource allocation, and strategic implications. By the time they adjourned, it was clear that Chin's actions had initiated something larger than a single successful mission. They had started a conversation about the future of military engagement in complex cultural environments. Meanwhile, in her temporary quarters, Chin worked on her transition report for the cultural advisory team. Her new assignment would involve developing training materials, consulting on mission planning, and serving as a liaison with local leaders. It represented both recognition of her unique skills and acknowledgement that the military needed to evolve. As she wrote, Chin reflected on the day's events and their broader implications. Her decision to approach the tribal gathering unarmed had been based on immediate tactical assessment, but its success suggested principles that could guide future operations. Trust, she wrote, was not the opposite of security, it was sometimes the foundation of security. The next morning brought news that would test everyone's understanding of the previous day's success. Staff Sergeant Vasquez arrived at Chin's quarters with an urgent message from the communications bunker. Chin, we've got a situation developing. That tribal elder you spoke with yesterday, Ahmad Shah Massoud, he's requesting an immediate meeting. Says there's intelligence about planned attacks against coalition forces, but he'll only share it with you. Chin grabbed her gear and followed Vasquez to the command center, where Colonel Hawthorne was studying intelligence reports with obvious concern. The colonel looked up as they entered. Chin, your new best friend has information about a coordinated attack plan for this week. Multiple targets, including supply convoys and forward operating bases. He claims he'll only share details with you personally. What's his motivation, ma'am? Chin asked, studying the preliminary reports. Why would he risk exposing himself by sharing intelligence with coalition forces? That's what we need to find out. But if his information is accurate, we're looking at potential casualties in the dozens. I'm authorizing an immediate meeting, but this time you'll have a full security escort. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Chin's diplomatic success had created new opportunities, but it had also created new responsibilities and new risks. Her relationship with local leadership could provide crucial intelligence, but it also made her a valuable target for hostile forces. 2 hours later, Chin found herself back in Kala Saved, this time with a full platoon providing security while she met with Ahmad Shah Massoud in the same compound where tribal disputes had been resolved the day before. The contrast was stark, yesterday's peaceful cultural exchange now overshadowed by urgent discussions of life and death intelligence. The situation has changed since yesterday, Massoud explained through translation, his weathered face grave with concern. Word of our cooperation with American forces has reached certain groups who oppose any collaboration with coalition forces. They plan to make examples of both your people and mine. Chin listened carefully, taking notes while evaluating the credibility of the information. Massoud's intelligence was specific: convoy routes, timing, methods of attack, and detailed enough to suggest inside knowledge of planning operations. "Why are you sharing this with us?" Chen asked directly. "Yesterday you were resolving water disputes. Today you're risking your life to prevent attacks. What changed?" Massoud's answer came slowly, carefully considered. "Yesterday I saw something I had not seen before from American soldiers. Respect. Understanding. The possibility that cooperation might bring something better than endless conflict. But there are those who prefer the certainty of conflict to the uncertainty of peace." The intelligence Massoud provided proved devastatingly accurate. Over the next 48 hours, coalition forces intercepted 3 planned attacks, potentially saving dozens of lives and preserving critical supply routes. But the success came at a cost. Massoud's cooperation had indeed marked him as a target for extremist groups. Chen found herself in an unexpected position as liaison between military command and local leadership. Her linguistic skills and cultural knowledge made her indispensable for maintaining the intelligence relationship, but her growing involvement in high-stakes operations raised questions about her training and preparation for such responsibilities. "Chen, I need to be honest with you," Colonel Hawthorne said during a private meeting in her office. "What you've accomplished in the past few days is remarkable, but you're operating at levels typically reserved for officers with years of specialized training. I'm concerned about putting that kind of pressure on a private first class." Chen considered the colonel's concern carefully. "Ma'am, I understand the responsibility, but this relationship exists because of trust built through personal connection. Transferring it to someone else might break that trust and lose the intelligence advantage." "I'm not talking about transferring the relationship," Hawthorne clarified. "I'm talking about giving you the rank, training, and support structure necessary to handle it properly. I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to sergeant and assignment to officer candidate school." The recommendation represented both recognition and transformation. Chen's unconventional approach had proven effective, but success at this level required institutional support and formal authority. Her personal initiative needed to become professional capability. As news of Chen's promotion spread through FB Kestrel, reactions reflected the ongoing debate about military adaptation and individual innovation. Some soldiers celebrated her success as proof that thinking beyond traditional boundaries could produce extraordinary results. Others worried that promoting unconventional behavior might undermine the discipline and consistency that made military operations effective. Specialist Hawkins, who had been among Chen's harshest critics, approached her with a perspective that had evolved significantly since their first patrol together. Sergeant Chen, I've been thinking about what happened out there. About assumptions and stereotypes and what it means to serve with honor. I want to apologize for some of the things I said." Chen's response reflected the growth in her own understanding of leadership and team dynamics. "Hawkins, your concerns weren't wrong. Military effectiveness does depend on predictability and discipline. But effectiveness also requires adaptation when circumstances change. Both perspectives have value. I'm trying to understand how they fit together," Hawkins continued. "How do you maintain discipline while encouraging innovation? How do you follow orders while thinking independently?" "Maybe that's the wrong question," Chen suggested. "Maybe the question is, how do you serve the mission most effectively? Sometimes that means following orders exactly. Sometimes it means adapting orders to circumstances. The key is knowing the difference." Their conversation was representative of broader discussions taking place throughout the military as leaders at all levels grappled with lessons learned from Chen's successful mission. Traditional military training emphasized adherence to established procedures, but complex cultural environments required flexible thinking and cultural sensitivity. The cultural advisory team that Chen joined represented an institutional attempt to systematize these capabilities. Her assignment involved developing training protocols that could teach cultural awareness and conflict de-escalation as standard military skills rather than personal attributes that some soldiers happened to possess. The challenge, explained Major Sarah Williams, who led the cultural advisory team, is maintaining the human element that made your approach successful while creating reproducible training methods. We need to teach empathy and cultural sensitivity without losing military effectiveness. Chen's first assignment involved developing case studies based on her experience in Kali Safed. The goal was to create training scenarios that would help other soldiers recognize when diplomatic approaches might be more effective than purely military responses. The key insight, Chen wrote in her training manual, is that military strength and cultural sensitivity are not opposing forces. Understanding local customs and speaking local languages can be force multipliers that make military operations more effective, not less effective. Her work attracted attention from military educators and policy makers who were grappling with similar challenges in other theaters of operation. The principles Chin had demonstrated, trust building, cultural awareness, conflict de-escalation, had applications beyond Afghanistan, in any environment where military forces operated among civilian populations. As weeks passed, the intelligence relationship Chin had established with Ahmad Shah Massoud continued to provide valuable information that prevented attacks and saved lives. But the relationship also evolved, becoming a model for broader engagement with local leadership throughout the region. Other cultural advisory team members began developing their own relationships with tribal elders, religious leaders, and community organizers. Chin's success had demonstrated the potential value of such connections, but it had also shown the need for systematic approaches to building and maintaining them. What you did was create a proof of concept, Major Williams explained during one of their planning sessions. Now we need to scale it up without losing the personal connections that make it work. The scaling process involved training programs for soldiers at all levels, from junior enlisted personnel to senior officers. Cultural awareness became a standard component of pre-deployment training, and language instruction received increased emphasis and resources. But perhaps the most significant change was conceptual, a shift in how military leaders thought about the relationship between force and diplomacy, between security and trust building. Chin's example had shown that sometimes the most effective military action was no military action at all. 6 months after her first mission to Kali Safed, Sergeant Chin stood before a group of newly arrived soldiers, sharing the lessons learned from her unconventional approach to military service. Her audience included both supporters and skeptics, soldiers eager to embrace new methods and others concerned about abandoning proven practices. The question isn't whether you should always choose diplomacy over force, she told them. The question is whether you have the skills and knowledge to recognize when diplomacy might be more effective than force. Military readiness means being prepared for all possible responses, not just the most obvious ones. One young soldier raised his hand. "Sergeant, what if we try your approach and it doesn't work? What if trusting people gets us killed?" Chin's answer reflected the hard-earned wisdom of experience. Private, every military decision involves risk. When you choose to engage an enemy force, you risk casualties. When you choose to trust potential allies, you also risk casualties. The question isn't how to avoid risk, it's how to choose the right risk for the mission and the circumstances. Another soldier, a corporal with obvious combat experience, challenged her directly. "Sergeant, with respect, you got lucky. One success doesn't prove that soft approaches work consistently. What about when the enemy doesn't want to talk?" Chin nodded, acknowledging the validity of his concern. "Corporal, you're absolutely right. Not every situation calls for diplomatic solutions. The Taliban fighters who plant IEDs on convoy routes aren't interested in cultural exchange. But the tribal elders who might know about those IED placements, they might be willing to share information if approached with respect rather than suspicion." The training session continued for 2 hours, covering practical techniques for cultural assessment, basic language skills, and protocols for transitioning between diplomatic and military responses. Chin emphasized that cultural awareness wasn't about replacing military capability, it was about enhancing it. "Your weapon is always your last resort," she explained, "but it should never be your only resort." As the new soldiers filed out, many approached Chin individually with questions that reflected both curiosity and skepticism about her methods. The institutional military was slowly adapting to incorporate lessons learned from her experience, but individual soldiers still needed to reconcile new approaches with established warrior culture. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had become one of Chin's most vocal supporters, remained after the others left. "Sergeant Chin, I've got news from higher command. Division wants to expand the Cultural Advisory Team program. They're looking at implementing it across all forward operating bases in the region." Chin felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. Success brought visibility, but visibility brought scrutiny and pressure to deliver consistent results. "What's the timeline, Staff Sergeant?" 6 months for full implementation. They want you to train the trainers, develop a cadre of soldiers who can establish their own cultural liaison programs. Rodriguez paused, studying her expression. "It's a big responsibility. You'll essentially be reshaping how the Army conducts operations in culturally complex environments." The weight of that responsibility wasn't lost on Chin. Her individual success was becoming institutional doctrine, affecting how thousands of soldiers would approach their missions. The quiet private first class who had walked unarmed toward potential enemies was now influencing military policy at the highest levels. That evening, Chin sat in her quarters writing reports that would inform training programs across multiple theater commands. Her phone rang, a call from her family back in California, who had learned about her promotion and new assignment through official military channels. "Sarah, we're so proud of what you've accomplished," her mother said, her voice carrying across the satellite connection. "But we worry about you taking these kinds of risks. Walking out there unarmed, trusting people who could have hurt you, it sounds terrifying." Chin considered how to explain her choices to family members who understood her service but not the complexities of her specific situation. "Mom, serving in a combat zone always involves risk. But sometimes the greatest risk is not trying to understand the people you're supposed to be protecting." "I don't understand how talking to strangers makes anyone safer," her father interjected, his concern evident even through the static of the long-distance connection. "Dad, remember when I was in high school and got in trouble for fighting with that kid who was bullying Jennifer Martinez? You told me that sometimes the right thing to do was stand up for someone else, even if it meant taking risks myself. That was different, Sarah. That was protecting someone you knew. This is the same principle, just on a larger scale. I'm protecting soldiers I serve with and civilians who are caught in the middle of conflicts they didn't choose. Sometimes protection means building bridges instead of burning them." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, touching on family news, her upcoming assignment to officer candidate school, and her long-term career plans. Her family's concern reflected broader civilian uncertainty about military operations in Afghanistan and the role of individual soldiers in complex geopolitical situations. After ending the call, Chin returned to her reports with renewed focus on practical applications. Her personal success needed to translate into systematic improvements that would help other soldiers navigate similar challenges without requiring her unique combination of language skills and cultural intuition. The next morning brought unexpected news that would test everything Chin had learned about the relationship between military force and diplomatic engagement. Staff Sergeant Vasquez approached her with urgent intelligence reports that painted a troubling picture of regional developments. "Sergeant Chin, we've got a problem. Intel indicates that your friend Ahmad Shah Massoud is under increasing pressure from extremist groups. They're threatening his family and his position in the tribal council because of his cooperation with coalition forces." Chin studied the reports with growing concern. Success in building relationships with local leaders meant accepting responsibility for their welfare. "What kind of protection can we offer him?" "That's the complication," Vasquez continued. "He's refusing protective custody or relocation. Says that accepting American protection would confirm accusations that he's become a puppet of foreign forces. But staying in place means accepting serious personal risk." The situation represented exactly the kind of complex challenge that conventional military doctrine struggled to address. Protecting an intelligence asset while preserving his credibility and effectiveness required understanding both security imperatives and cultural dynamics. Colonel Hawthorne summoned Chin to an emergency briefing where senior staff discussed options for maintaining the intelligence relationship while ensuring Massoud's safety. The conversation revealed how Chin's initial success had created ongoing obligations that extended far beyond her original mission parameters. "The problem," explained Major Kingston, "is that we've created expectations on both sides that we're not sure we can fulfill. Massoud expects us to understand his constraints and limitations. Higher command expects us to maintain intelligence access without compromising operational security." Chin listened to the discussion while formulating a response based on her growing understanding of the intersection between military objectives and cultural realities. "Sir, maybe we're thinking about this backwards. Instead of trying to protect Massoud as an individual asset, maybe we should focus on legitimizing cooperation with coalition forces as a community benefit." "Explain," Colonel Hawthorne said. "If Massoud is being targeted for helping us, then other potential cooperators are watching to see how we respond. If we abandon him, we signal that cooperation with American forces is dangerous and unrewarded. But if we can demonstrate that cooperation brings tangible benefits to the whole community, not just to individual leaders, then his position becomes more defensible." The briefing continued for another hour as staff officers developed plans based on Chin's recommendation. Instead of focusing solely on Massoud's personal security, they would implement development projects and security improvements that benefited the entire region while making cooperation with coalition forces appear beneficial rather than treasonous. "It's a more complex approach," Major Williams acknowledged. but it might be more sustainable in the long term. We're building relationships with communities rather than just individuals. Implementation of the new approach required Chin to expand her role once again, coordinating with civil affairs units, development specialists, and local contractors to deliver visible improvements to infrastructure and security in areas where tribal leaders had cooperated with coalition forces. The work was challenging and time-consuming, requiring her to balance multiple competing priorities while maintaining the personal relationships that had made the program possible in the first place. But it also represented the evolution of her approach from individual initiative to systematic policy. Over the following weeks, Chin found herself traveling throughout the region, meeting with tribal councils, religious leaders, and community organizers to explain how cooperation with coalition forces could benefit their communities without compromising their independence or cultural integrity. The key, she explained to one particularly skeptical group of elders, is that we're not asking you to become Americans. We're asking you to work with us to make your communities safer and more prosperous while remaining true to your own values and traditions. The responses varied widely, from enthusiastic cooperation to polite rejection to outright hostility. But gradually, Chin began to see patterns that suggested her approach was gaining traction among leaders who had been hesitant to engage with foreign military forces. Ahmad Shah Massoud, who had initially been isolated for his cooperation, found his position strengthened as other leaders began to see the practical benefits of engagement. The development projects and security improvements that followed cooperation provided concrete evidence that working with coalition forces could produce tangible benefits for ordinary citizens. "You have changed the conversation," Massoud told Chin during one of their regular meetings. Before, cooperation meant choosing sides in a conflict. Now it means choosing development over stagnation, progress over isolation. But success also brought new challenges and unexpected consequences. As word of Chin's methods spread through military channels, she found herself assigned to increasingly sensitive and complex missions that tested the limits of her cultural knowledge and diplomatic skills. One particularly challenging assignment involved mediating a dispute between two tribal groups whose conflict had been exploited by Taliban forces to destabilize the region. The situation required Chin to understand not just language and customs, but centuries of historical grievances and complex kinship relationships. "This is beyond what any individual soldier should be expected to handle," Major Williams observed during mission planning. "We're asking Chin to be a diplomat, anthropologist, historian, and military advisor all at once." Chin agreed with the assessment, but also understood that the military's institutional capacity for cultural engagement was still developing. "Ma'am, you're right that this exceeds normal expectations. But we're operating in an environment where normal expectations don't apply. Sometimes you have to improvise with the capabilities you have while building the capabilities you need." The tribal mediation took place over 3 days in a neutral location established specifically for the proceedings. Chin found herself facilitating discussions between leaders whose families had been feuding for generations, trying to find common ground that would serve both their immediate interests and broader regional stability. The process was exhausting and frequently frustrating, requiring her to translate not just words but concepts, expectations, and emotional nuances that didn't have direct equivalents across cultural boundaries. Success required understanding the difference between what people said and what they meant, between formal positions and underlying interests. "Both of your families have legitimate concerns about water access and grazing rights," Chin explained through careful translation during one particularly tense session. "But those concerns have been manipulated by outside forces who benefit from your conflict. The question is whether you want to continue fighting each other while others profit from your conflict, or work together to control your own destiny." Gradually, through patience and persistence, Chin helped the tribal leaders develop a framework for resolving their immediate disputes while establishing mechanisms for addressing future conflicts without external manipulation. The agreement wasn't perfect, but it represented a significant step toward regional stability. Colonel Hawthorne, who had observed portions of the mediation process, expressed both admiration and concern about the precedent being set. "Chin, what you accomplished was remarkable. But we can't build our entire regional strategy around the unique capabilities of one individual. We need to institutionalize these skills across the force." "I agree, ma'am. But institutionalizing cultural competence is more complex than teaching marksmanship or radio procedures. It requires understanding context, history, and human psychology in ways that can't be reduced to simple protocols." The conversation reflected broader challenges facing military forces operating in culturally complex environments worldwide. Traditional military training emphasized technical proficiency and adherence to established procedures, but effective cultural engagement required flexibility, empathy, and interpretive skills that were difficult to systematize. Chin's assignment to Officer Candidate School represented an attempt to address these challenges by developing leaders who combined military competence with cultural awareness. Her experience would inform curriculum development and training protocols for future officers who would face similar challenges in other theaters of operation. As her deployment in Afghanistan neared its end, Chin reflected on the transformation that had occurred since her first patrol to Kali Safed. The quiet private first class who had been criticized for not fitting the warrior stereotype had become a sergeant whose methods were reshaping military doctrine and training programs. But perhaps more importantly, she had demonstrated that military service could be both effective and humane, that strength could be expressed through understanding as well as force, and that true courage sometimes meant choosing trust over suspicion even in the most dangerous circumstances. Her final mission report, which would be studied at military academies and staff colleges for years to come, concluded with an observation that captured the essence of her experience. Military effectiveness in complex cultural environments requires more than superior firepower and advanced technology. It requires the ability to see potential allies where others see only threats, to build bridges where others see only barriers, and to choose cooperation over conflict whenever both serve the mission equally well. The uniform doesn't just represent our willingness to fight for our values. It represents our commitment to extending those values to others through example rather than force alone. The day Chin departed FB Kestrel, soldiers throughout the base gathered to acknowledge her contributions and wish her success in her new assignment. The ceremony was informal but meaningful, representing recognition not just of her individual achievements but of the broader principles she had demonstrated. "You showed us that being a good soldier doesn't mean being the same kind of soldier," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez said during his farewell remarks. "You proved that innovation and tradition can work together, that thinking differently doesn't mean thinking wrong." Specialist Hawkins, who had traveled from his new assignment specifically to attend the ceremony, offered a perspective that reflected how much his own thinking had evolved. "Sergeant Chin taught me that courage has many faces. Sometimes it looks like charging into battle. Sometimes it looks like walking unarmed towards strangers and choosing to trust instead of fear." As Chin's transport aircraft lifted off from the base that had been her home for over a year, she looked down at the Afghan landscape that had taught her so much about herself, about service, and about the complex relationship between military power and human connection. Her story would continue at Officer Candidate School, where she would help train the next generation of military leaders to navigate cultural complexities with wisdom and humanity. But the lessons learned in the villages and valleys of Afghanistan would remain with her forever, lessons about the extraordinary power of choosing understanding over assumption, cooperation over conflict, and trust over fear. The quiet soldier who had once been called a disgrace to the uniform had redefined what the uniform could represent. In doing so, she had honored not just her own service, but the highest ideals of military professionalism, protecting others, serving something greater than oneself, and having the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult or misunderstood. Her legacy would live on in the training programs she helped develop, the policies she influenced, and the soldiers she inspired to see beyond traditional boundaries toward new possibilities for service and sacrifice. The uniform she wore represented not just her individual achievements, but the ongoing evolution of military service in an increasingly complex and interconnected world.